I want to talk today about the history of sword fittings outside of Japan in collections, museums, and the people who were involved in forming those collections. When the Haitore was passed in Japan in 1876, outlawing the wearing of swords in public, a tremendous number of swords and fittings came onto the open market, and the Western foreigners were flocking to Japan because they had access now to the country and could view material in Japan as well as be accepted in their society. What happened was that various clubs, societies, and groups formed over Europe and America, much of it at the same time. The earliest auction of Japanese sword fittings in America was in 1885, when a collection was sold at an auction house in New York that no longer exists. As far as the museums were concerned, the most important collection of any Japanese art outside of Japan are in the Boston Museum in Massachusetts, the U.S. A Dr. Bigelow, a Dr. Fenollosa, and a friend of theirs, Morse, went to Japan and spent actually various years buying material which was readily available at that time, because the Japanese population had gone very Western. They were wearing Western-style clothes. They had abandoned most of the traditions of the past and were frantic for new fashions and designs that were being introduced from Europe and America. So the foreigners who were there were able to buy material that would never have been able to leave the country anytime since that period. The Boston Museum collection has materials of National Treasure class, what's called kokuho, and Dr. Bigelow bought hundreds of sword guards and swords at that time and brought them back to the Boston Museum. He even had tsuba made for him by the leading contemporary artists who were still working in Tokyo at that time, a man called Uno Shomin. And those tsuba are in the Boston Museum, and they are inscribed, made to the order of Dr. Bigelow. There are probably as many as 1,000 tsuba in the Boston Museum. There's been several catalogs, none of them comprehensive. They concentrated more on the swords than the fittings because the sword collection in the Boston is outstanding. Once Europe became the headquarters, moved to London naturally. The London Japanese Society was formed in 1892 and wasn't dissolved until about 10 years ago when they closed the institution down. There was the Franco-Japanese Society, which published a very nice monthly periodical for 50 years or more. The Japan Society of London's periodicals were extremely fine. I mean, the translations were phenomenal for the time period. They totally translated the ancient Kojiki and Nihongi material, which was mostly legendary. They had meetings where they discussed the Japanese arts in great detail with very knowledgeable people. And most of those people then had communication between themselves because they were all dedicated or very interested in any form of Japanese art. Because of the ban on wearing swords, that was one of the areas that was most prominent. The first English collector was a man named Hawkshaw, who had whaling ships which were in the Pacific Ocean. And occasionally he was given permission to enter Japanese waters. And it is said, and I presume it's true, that he brought barrels of Suba back to London and had them taken to his country home, where they stayed until his auction in the time just prior to the First World War. There were probably as many as 20 major collections in England. By 1910-12, why Henri Joly from Belgium, who was a French language teacher in an English boys' school, arrived in London. And his interest was almost exclusively in the swords fittings, primarily Suba. He wrote catalogs for most of the major collections that were in existence. Unfortunately, he died of cancer in 1919. So much of his work was crammed into a matter of maybe 10 years. In Germany, there was a number of very important collections. The most important was probably the Utter collection, which was in the Berlin Museum and is said to now be in the basement of the Leningrad Museum in Russia. But it was an extremely comprehensive collection. There was a one-of-everything type of where all schools, all types, all periods were represented. A friend had told me that he actually went to look and they were still in their original boxes, hopefully undisturbed, but they'll never come back, I don't think. The next most important collection there is the Hamburg collection, which was formed by a man called Shinkichi Hara, who fell under the power and sway of Justus Brinkmann, who was part of the Hamburg Museum at that time, but it turned out to be a very valuable combination where Hara both bought in Japan and Brinkmann encouraged him to write first 1902 Index of Artists, later a 1931 Index of Artists. Unfortunately, the Hamburg Museum collection has never been cataloged, and it should be. The next most important group is in Denmark, a man called Halverstad, who was adopted into the Halverstad family, but he was a brilliant man, and he formed an excellent collection, which is still intact at the museum in Denmark, and I've seen that. Well, I've seen most of these museum collections. Then you have to move to the Louvre in Paris has a huge number of Suba, but it's very random, and Bob Butterboy, my friend who lives in Paris, said that it is not very good. In London, naturally, the Victoria and Albert Museum and the London British Museum have huge, thousands of pieces, but neither of them were cataloged, or are they really considered comprehensive. Most of the experts of that period were much more interested in the fittings that were made after 1700, the fancy work that was done in the later Edo period, than they were in the early material, and so there's only a minimum of examples of pieces before 1600, certainly. But these collections, most of them exist as they were today. Oh, there's one other, you have to mention the Metropolitan Museum in New York City has 4,000 Suba. But again, they've never been cataloged. I viewed a few of them. There's a card catalog that you can go through if you have the patience. But it's never been properly cataloged, and it's a very good collection with a lot of fancy late material mixed into it. They have much of, say 100 pieces on exhibit, a random selection, and not greatly important. Most of these museums don't exhibit the material. You can make arrangements to see them if you can contact the people in charge. In Italy, there were a couple of collections, mostly Japanese armor, surprisingly enough, not fittings. But there was a man who started collecting in the 1960s and 70s, who formed a very important collection, unfortunately. We don't know the status of it today, but it is certainly a one-of-everything collection, and probably the most important private collection outside of Japan. The rest of the United States, there's collections in many museums of varying quality, varying type, and most of them were donated to the museums by people over the last 100 years, and they don't amount to a great deal. The best way of trying to see as much as you can, you would have to write to the museum, and then they can make arrangements for you to actually go and view the collection once you have the entree. The experts in the West, there was, surprisingly enough, very soon after 1900, a Japanese dealer family, Yamanaka and Company, who set up stores in Paris, London, New York, Boston, and Chicago, and sold all types of Japanese art. At the time of the Second World War, their assets were seized and auctioned off, so very little of their material arrangement still exists. I was able to visit the Boston store, which had survived the war years and was still in business about 1971. As far as other dealers are concerned, there's a man in Paris who was Hayashi, who wrote a large number of catalogs on fittings with no knowledge whatsoever. Naturally, these are all black and white photographs, and some of them are fairly good because they use glass slides. But Hayashi made himself out to be a great authority, and unfortunately, the information he put into the French catalogs are very bad. At the time, this all came to a screeching halt at the time of the First World War. And limped and did recover a little bit in the 1920s and 30s, but by naturally 1930 there was the Great Depression, so people were not interested in collecting or anything other than survival. After the Second World War, why, there was all of a sudden an increase in the number of people because there were hundreds and hundreds of GIs who had served their time in the occupation of Japan and bought or were given a great number of swords and fittings, which they brought back to the United States in great quantities, and they were found. In those days, they were found mostly in pawn shops because the military men had pawned them, or they were found in gun dealers' stores. But the vast quantity of that material has since gone to collectors all over the United States, and you no longer find that sort of thing anymore. When I visited, there was a sword gun dealer in Los Angeles that I visited, who was very near my home, and he had wooden barrels around the room filled with Japanese swords. Each barrel, there were thousands of them. But the fittings themselves were available, and a number, probably the most significant private collection that was formed was a man called Mosley, Alexander Mosley, who had his collection formed by the experts in Japan. A man, Hino, who was the chief clerk for the Amiya family business, very diligently formed his collection, which was literally a one of everything. I mean, every school, every generation of every artist was represented, and Mosley wanted to give it to the German government on the condition that he got a bond in front of his name. Well, they didn't agree on that, so it never happened. But he went to New York in the years just following the war, and his collection was auctioned off in New York, which was a great shame, because he had offered it to the museum in Metropolitan Museum in New York, and they turned him down. They didn't accept it, which was a huge mistake. But the number of collectors who existed at that time were in the hundreds. They're still in the hundreds. The convention we have in San Francisco each year brings maybe 500 people who are just collectors of Japanese swords and fittings. Naturally, this is decreasing every year because the age of the people is quite close, and the young people are not interested, so it will decrease each year, and the material will come back on the market from these private collections. But on the whole, the West has contributed many books on sword fittings in almost all of the European languages and English naturally. And a great deal has been written. None of it you could call serious research, but it's certainly been good cataloging and good record keeping and recording of the material over the last 150 years. So we did contribute a little bit to the history of the fittings, and we hope that someone can in the future continue on from here.